Allora, buongiorno.
Good morning to you all. Welcome to this debate on climate change and renewable energy, integrated approaches, tools, and development cooperation experiences. Why do we want to deal with this topic? Well, actually, we want to define the link between energy and climate change. Newspapers and the press show that climate change is increasing. There's different changes, ice melting, hotter summers, extreme weather events. They are becoming more and more frequent. For years and for decades, we've been talking about climate change, but we couldn't actually see it with our own eyes. Now we actually see it every day. And we want to talk about this together with energy. On the one end, energy significantly contributes to increase in CO2 emissions. On the other, it is a necessary factor for human development, i.e. healthcare, human development, and social and economic development. So together with our speakers today, we are going to deal with these topics and links and interactions, and we will give a global perspective. What happens in the world is increasingly something happening outside Europe in terms of size of population and CO2 emissions. So we want to have a look at what is happening in Africa, a continent of paramount importance for the destiny of African people, Europe and the world as a whole, and other continents such as Asia. I will now introduce the different speakers during the debate. So we will start off with Mr. Marco Margheri to my right. Marco is the chairman of the World Energy Council for Italy. Marco will give us a general overview on this topic and will describe us how businesses and economic models are meeting these challenges. And I'm going to give you the floor. Marco. Thank you very much to Stefano. Thank you very much to the meeting for this great opportunity. It is always very nice for me to come back to the meeting. You mentioned some keywords. First, climate change. I don't want to talk about today's news. I want to talk about what we are doing and what we can do on climate change. In 2015, in Paris, many countries signed an agreement whereby climate change should be stopped, and that should be a priority for our communities. That should be done by engaging the different countries to increase a temperature increase exceeding 1.5 degrees by 2050. So what engagements have been taken so far? Well, so far, engagements are hardly sufficient to have an increase in temperature by 2050 exceeding 3 degrees. Should we significantly increase today's engagements of the countries signing the Paris Agreement, we would reach more than 2 degrees in increase in temperature. Basically, talking about climate change, we realize that our communities, our societies, today are not on the right track and are not fully exploiting their potential. With reference to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, we can say that they are very useful because they give us a general overview of the population, of the planet population as a whole. Now, let's talk about prosperity and energy. Talking about prosperity through energy, 1 billion people are left behind. 640 million in Africa, people in Africa, today do not have good access to energy. Speakers after me will talk about different aspects of energy consumption, the possibility to cook at home without health risks. So we do realize that there's a contradiction in business models and development models which need to be solved. We need to increase our efforts to mitigate climate change, but we cannot forget about 1 billion people who are living in extreme energy poverty. Let's talk about Africa. When talking about these topics, usually you tend to look at what is not working. But Africa is an extraordinary continent. In Africa, there's 6 out of the 10 major world economies for growth by growth rate. Some countries are really increasing very fast. In Africa, there are countries that now have full access to energy, such as Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, which today is reaching 96-97% of access to energy consumption. South Africa, for example, have a per capita consumption of kilowatt hour of home energy, which is very similar to the Italian one, 4,800 for an Italian person, 3,900 for people living in South Africa. In Chad, according to the latest data by the World Bank, one citizen of Chad consumes 18 kilowatt hours per year. So you can realize that when talking about energy and climate change, we need to think about the present and the future. We don't only have to think about the past. We need to to understand the correct balance in order to promote future energy policies. And there are 3 keywords I want to share with you. Before giving the floor to the other speakers and maybe some Q&A session. First of all, the first keyword is renewable energy. The renewable energy is one of the tools that will change the way we consume energy worldwide. So all of a sudden, over the past 15 years, what always seemed to be too expensive or too difficult or hard to manage has become cheaper, easier, and much easier to manage for electricity purposes. In Italy, for example, we have developed, and by 2025, we will double solar energy. The second keyword is the relation between the center and the periphery. Energy systems, after the second industrial revolution, have been centralized. As in, engineers have told us that it was much more efficient to build up a big central station, a big energy station, like carbon at the beginning or coal energy station, and connected to the different networks and the grid. And this is how our electrical systems have been built so far. Renewable energy do give us a new model whereby the system is no longer centralized, but they are built there where you can find energy, like solar energy or wind energy. So energy systems are built closer to the people compared to the past. Now, that enables us, for example, in Africa or in areas where you have a poor access to energy, new business models. For example, local production can be used for local consumption without having to build the grid. These are the off-grid models. I will give you an example. We have the Barefoot College. And this is a very trendy system. It is the Barefoot College is a structure whereby women from rural villages are given training in order to build community solar plants. These women go back to their own villages and they have become the energy mayors of their own village. This is a structure which is made possible by technologies and by digitalization, as well as by the increase in the skills of hundreds of millions of people who every year are becoming less poor. And this initiative can change the lifestyle of these communities. Now, the third keyword is a bit more complicated, and it is integration. There's no piecemeal energy policy. No energy policy that can only be based on renewable energy. Let's see Africa, for example. In Africa, today, there's poor consumption, which is very scattered around, but there are many resources, which are mainly focused on gas, in the gas sector. In the Mediterranean, in the Eastern Mediterranean, and therefore in Northern African areas, and Algeria, for example, and in Sub-Saharan Africa, there are many resources which these countries need to exploit. And this is a major challenge. Because these countries must be enabled to transform traditional energy resources into correct consumption in order not to reduce the use of renewable energy, but to finance it. And we need to build a world where investments in Africa on raw materials should be coordinated in order to avoid Chinese models, for example, which are used in Africa. These models are not geared towards developing these communities, but only want to exploit energy resources of the African continent. To conclude, I don't want to advertise our facilitator, and I don't want to flatter him. The European Union must play a primary role in this context because in terms of businesses such as Enel and Eni in Italy, which are two major Italian companies that work together with local communities in Africa, Eni, for example, is producing in 4 African countries and leaves 100% of its own production in Africa, as in Enel does not steal energy from Africa. Enel, through West for Africa, has built an extraordinary system to develop local communities. So the European Union can play a fundamental role because it has extraordinary skills and values. So it can lead to sustainable development together with growth in energy and sustainable development. Thank you.
Grazie Marco.
Thank you, Marco. Well, you really touched upon the main points that will be useful to go on with our debate. First of all, you've mentioned the fact that we're not on the right track, and the current approach should not continue, because otherwise the objectives of the Paris Agreement won't be achieved, because global warming will be much more than what is stated in the objectives that are considered to be sustainable by the international community. You also mentioned renewable energy, especially you refer to decentralized models of development and of production and consumption of energy, which is particularly suitable to the features of the African continent, and then the need for an integrated approach. These factors are particularly relevant to Francesca Oliva's presentation, who's here to the left, and she deals with entrepreneurship and the social entrepreneurship initiatives, and I would like her to reflect upon the stimuli that Marco presented and to contextualize them in sub-Saharan Africa that refer to her experience she can talk about. Francesca. Yes, thank you. I would like to begin with integration as a term, which is so important also in what AVSI does in terms of human development. We deal with development in communities, in families, by promoting a protagonist role in the families and in the communities. We try to provide people with tools to generate well-being for themselves and for their families, and to help them rediscover their dignity. How do we do this? We deal with many projects about education, healthcare, etc. But there's not just one single action that can solve all the problems. Different areas must be tackled, and this way a kind of world is created around a person, and this person needs tools to become a protagonist. And energy is a fundamental element indeed. It has been defined, energy access has been defined as an instrumental right. That is, it is a prerequisite for other rights. For example, having access to healthcare services. If there's no energy, healthcare services cannot be provided in an adequate way, but also in schools without access to energy, many subjects cannot be taught. And even in households, a fridge cannot work without energy, and so there's no conservation of food, and food security cannot be preserved, and children cannot move around freely and safely, and the women cannot move around safely. So this is a good that is really fundamental to get access to other kinds of goods. We refer to countries in Africa that are really affected by the absence of access to energy. There's millions of people, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa and in Asia too. And there's extreme areas, remote areas, where this kind of resource is really needed. We call them the last mile communities, the last mile in a geographical sense. That is, these people live far away from the urban areas where there's energy networks, but also they are far away from development, because the absence of these services generates great poverty. These communities and these populations in the last mile are most vulnerable to the effects of climate change, because they only rely on agriculture, and agriculture is most affected by, for example, droughts and torrential rains, etc. And this is so in many areas of the world where seasons are not as they used to be, because people do not know when the rain season is going to start. In the past, this was not the case, but now there's a big confusion about it. So when there's a climate shock, these communities are really grappling with difficulties, and they do not know how to deal with that. So what do we do for these communities? We have defined a model, perhaps a new model that could be promoted to bring electricity where it's not there, that is in partnership with the private sector. We work with communities where private subjects invest. They develop small networks, small facilities that can generate renewable energy, so it's solar energy or hydraulic energy in small communities. It's about small amounts of kilowatts, up to 500 kilowatts. So it's a very little amount of energy, but this is fundamental for those small communities. And so what do we do together with the private sector? I'm going to give you an example. In 2015, Our first project was in Uganda, in the Chitobo Island in the Victoria Lake. It's an island with fishermen, about 1,500 people and 500 families. These people live on fishing, and they used to fish, but they could not sell all their catch to the market because the supply chain was affected by the lack of ice. They could not conserve the fish, and so fishermen would leave in the morning, early in the morning, to buy ice in the mainland, and then back to the island. Half of the ice would have melted, and then what they could use was used to conserve fish. But then conservation was really limited in time, so they had to throw away a lot of fish. The process was sort of adjusted by using the lake water, but the lake water was dirty, and so there were diseases carried with that. So thanks to an Italian company, a solar energy plant of 250 kilowatt was installed, and this made it possible to have electricity in households, but also it was used for production activities. And this was important for our organization, who played a helpful role to help people understand how to use, in a most effective way, the energy in their community with the greatest impact. This means how to bring well-being, how to bring healthcare services, and so especially women and entrepreneurs were helped to start businesses so that they could earn out of other resources rather than fishing and agriculture. So this also generated employment, and there was a small company to produce ice or to clean water. And so many people had access to fridge and to other tools, other equipment. So things changed, and other people from other islands moved to this island because in this island the situation was different. So there was a radical change in the life of that community, and this was achieved in a sustainable way because a company went there to invest its capital in the island, selling the energy at a convenient price for the people there, and the people were trained to be able to use the energy in an effective way. So what is needed to do this? Integration is needed. Integration among the actors dealing with energy production, for example, NGOs, the private sector, and international cooperation too, with EU funding or Italian cooperation funding, and also the intervention of other countries. For example, a similar integration is present in Mozambique, where there is a pilot project now going on about a small network in a rural area of the northwest of Mozambique. And the intervention of Italian cooperation is fundamental, as it is helping the local authorities to define and to find the rules, the laws that are needed to be able to manage investments, because the appropriate rules are needed, the incentives are needed. NGOs and the private sector need to know how to go about that. And this model can be at the basis of a system to achieve the objective of sustainable development number 7. Thank you.
Grazie Francesca.
Thank you very much, Francesca. What you said is particularly important. We have seen the importance of access to energy as a tool to achieve other objectives and to enjoy other rights such as healthcare and education, as well as the fact that the life of people and families depend on access to energy. When access to energy is not guaranteed, everything is difficult, like storing a vaccine, for example, or managing a school or a hospital, not to mention, for example, businesses, management of businesses. In order to sell ice cream, or to sell ice, you need to have access to the grid, access to energy. If that is not done, well, most of the times needs are met only by electrogenic diesel groups. Africa is full of electrogenic groups which are highly polluting and are very expensive. This is not in line with the principles of good economy, and oftentimes electrogenic plants are the only possible option. So it is absolutely key to develop a sustainable access to energy. You provided us some examples of Mozambique and Uganda. It is important to develop solutions in rural areas with mini grids, for example. In a rural context, for example, especially in Africa, a continent with 44 million square kilometers, it is very wide. And in Africa, you have the problem of the distribution of electricity. So not always do countries have resources, but also sometimes they miss the skills to provide electricity to remote areas and remote communities. Hence, we need to develop local production and local consumptions with independent energy systems. They can be a solution in specific context. So Marco gave us some key facts and figures on energy poverty. Alessandro Galimberti is from AVSI, and he is the focal point for climate change and clean cooking. Now he will talk to us about a topic which is often not debated, which is clean cooking. Clean cooking is a word that in Italian we use actually in English because it is impossible to translate. We are talking about the production of energy for food consumption, for cooking and for eating. And he will give us some practical examples. Alessandro, I'm going to give you the floor. I was given the task to be more practical and be less academic. So let me share with you what I did to work on energy and to work as an expert on energy. I'm really interested in the energy sector. And I became passionate about it all of a sudden because in 2014 I was in Mozambique. I was in charge of an AVSI project, and they suggested me to work on a project to distribute ovens, effective cooking systems, let's say. They are sort of barbecues which can save coal. Then maybe I will explain to you what they are. They are basically barbecues enabling people to save coal while cooking. Before, I was working in the commercial sector. I was not working on development cooperation, and I also sold the kitchens. And for example, I was the commercial director for the US of an Italian brand of furniture. And I was working in Beverly Hills, so you can imagine the fact that I needed to reach a certain monthly budget, and in Milan, AVSI was asking me to distribute these improved barbecues, improved ovens in the slums, in order to achieve a certain budget. And it was very hard for me because I was much more interested in education. We were building schools. We were working on slums. In 2015, I was sent to an international conference on renewable energy in Cape Town. I participated in a meeting on clean cooking. And an expert of the World Health Organization took the floor and said that due to the damage of the use of coal and charcoal in homes, more than 2 million people die every year. Due to smoke intoxication, because they use coal, there's more people dying in Africa because of that than for HIV and malaria. And I was shocked by that. And then a person from the International Energy Agency took the floor and said that 2 billion people, 2.8 billion people worldwide are still cooking with coal and charcoal and wood. And what I was mostly struck by is that the International Energy Agency says that by 2030 there will be still more than 2 billion people using wood and charcoal to cook. So I took the floor and said, but what are we talking about? Because if we talk about renewable energy, I wanted to be provocative. So I said, if we want to talk about renewable energy and by 2030 there will still be more than 2 billion people cooking with wood and charcoal, what is a possible solution? I mean, we cannot stand on laurels. We cannot wait for technology. We need to do something more. Therefore, I became passionate about this topic concerning 2 billion brothers and sisters of mine, and I started to study the topic just like I did in marketing. So I started to sell door by door these improved barbecues, improved ovens. And I was selling them door by door in the slums. So in Mozambique, for example, I was in the slum trying to sell these ovens, barbecues. They were very cheap, but we cannot say that. At a lower price, they were funded. In short, AVSI project was very successful. 200,000 people were beneficiaries of this project. Every month, people using the improved barbecues and ovens can save 2 million kilos coal every month. Every year, they can save 200,000 tons of CO2 by using those systems. We found out, for example, that in cities, and that should give you some food for thought, in cities, in African cities, I was saying, where people, in theory, do have access to energy. In African slums, people do have access to energy. It's not like rural areas where they have a poor access. And energy is still used for cooking. In slums, in African slums, people continue to cook with wood and charcoal. I spent almost 20,000 hours in the slums, and I still cannot understand the secret why many African families cannot understand that they don't have to use wood and charcoal. Well, there are many reasons for that. The first reason being an economic one. The problem is not that they don't have the money to buy the improved oven or barbecue, whereby they can save 50% of coal. It just costs €5. It's not much for families. The families we're working with earn about 100, 150 euro a month, but they don't get the money at the end of the month like us. They get the money day by day, and this is a problem, because they cannot pay the electricity fee at the end of the month, because at the end of the month they don't have the money to do that. Then there's the pay-per-use system for electricity. Now they have other energy systems like recharge systems. But the big bag of coal lasting a month costs 25 euro. Sorry, 15 euro. Whereas they buy many small bags, which are very cheap, and at the end of the month, they spend 25 euros, so they spend twice as much. So why wouldn't they buy the big bag of coal so they would save 50% of the money? Because they don't have 15 euro as a whole. And even the families who don't have 100, 150 euro, they can increase by 10, 15% their consumption and their access to energy, which is incredible. In African cities, they can spend 20% of their income in wood or coal just to cook, which is quite a lot on a family income. So I became the focal point for this sector. 2 weeks ago, I went back to Mozambique, to rural areas, and it's a totally different stories right now. In rural areas, they don't have any incentive to save coal because wood was available for free. 10 years later, a lot of forest has been destroyed because of that, because of the wood used for cooking. That's incredible. However, there's no way and there is no argument that can convince people to shift to improved ovens or improved barbecues. In many areas, we are trying to push on them, but it is a sort of educational shift which requires a lot of effort. And this is fascinating. And it requires an integrated approach, an holistic approach, I would say, as the church is teaching us. Development must be human development, otherwise it is no development as such. I think that this is one of the sectors where the integrated approach is of the utmost importance, and it is self-evident. The person has to be considered as such and must be put at the center. Otherwise, it is very difficult, for example, to explain to poor people why they should protect the environment. And they cannot understand it because they cannot pay for environmental protection. To conclude, and I want to be provocative here, I'm really struck by the fact that there's hundreds of millions of people in Africa, in urban areas, having access to electricity, and they could spend less for electricity. Still, they still continue to behave like in the past. They cannot stop using coal or wood to cook. They should use something else, but they cannot understand why, and they don't do it. Okay, thank you very much, Alessandro.
I forgot to mention at the beginning that the last 30 minutes of this debate will be an open discussion with the audience. So if you have questions, please note them down, because we would like to use a good part of the time available to have a dialogue with the audience. I saw Marco that maybe wanted to mention something. Yes, indeed. I didn't want to stop him presenting, but I think that Marco mentioned something that is really interesting, and it's something that I promised myself I wouldn't do. And a horrible word like leapfrogging that we use also in Italian, which is the leap of a frog, which connects to what we mentioned about integration. Basically, Alessandro said that on the basis of how the economy works in some communities, energy in Africa and in certain contexts is being paid through prepaid recharges of mobile phones or top-up cards for mobile phones, because telecommunications have developed much faster with the related technology, for example, through mobile payments. And this is now part and parcel of the daily life of many communities. And you gave us an example of cooperation. So there I see the seed of business innovation that is so strong, and it's developing in Africa, and it's instead hard to find in Europe. So it's good to see that there's an evolution, a quality evolution of business models, and this gives us the feeling of how difficult the challenge is, but also how big the opportunities there are. Well, yes, you're right, and this is what is also known as humble innovation. For example, there's contexts where there's limited resources and access to technology is maybe limited, so other models are used, and those models are then exported to other countries. For example, India is an example of this kind of innovation, because these technologies are also used in India on a large scale. And what you mentioned with the pay-as-you-go systems, where you pay through top-up charges, and this is linked to solar panels and energy production in that way. So the consumer does not really need to invest a lot of money at the beginning to buy the equipment, but only consumption is paid for, and that's more in line with the income standards of the people. This is fundamental in countries such as Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. Another example I would like to mention is this. Maybe this is a model that is not very well known in our country, but in Tanzania there is this system whereby trucks go to small villages and they bring big batteries, so people can pay for recharging those batteries. These are small consumptions, of course, but they can make a difference to keep the light on, or to recharge a mobile phone, or to watch TV. And then after a few days, the same truck comes again, and the exhausted battery is returned in exchange for a new and recharged battery. I can't remember now the name of the company providing this service that has been so successful in Tanzania, but the employees are women for 70%. So that's really a good example. In the previous presentations, we have already mentioned the tensions that may occur in the case of having access to energy and other rights. For example, in the case of clean cooking and deforestation and the danger for biodiversity. And this is also the case for other contexts. In particular, we know that there's tensions between some objectives, in particular when we talk about climate. Asia is a classic example. On the one hand, Asia has registered great progress in terms of energy access, for example, in India, Indonesia, or in Burma. On the other hand, in 2017, total emissions have increased considerably because the increase in energy demand has not been covered completely with new energy type or renewable energy. So there's a lot to do about this. There's a lot of links with other competencies and areas, and I would like to give the floor now to Professor Roberto Zoboli, who's Professor of Economic Policy at the Catholic University of the Sacred Heart in Milan, so we can complete the first part of this debate about development. Thank you, Stefano. My presentation is in between the previous ones and relies on the works of some PhD students, for example, Simone Tagliapietra, who work in Brussels, or Lucia Dal Negro, who has a startup of her own, and Mr. Franceschini, who's also working on another project about climate change in Africa, and Giacomo Falchetti, who is working on access to renewable energy in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm saying this because the Catholic University is present in this. It's always been present, and its presence will be increasing. Francesca herself was educated in our university, who works not just at a theoretical way, but also at an operational, practical way. And at the very left end of the hall, we have a stand for the Catholic University. I had to mention that, sorry. When we talk about renewable energy, what we focus on is the Sustainable Development Goal number 7. And it is quite hard to look at this objective, development objective in isolation, because in general, we know that sustainable development objectives are not additive, but they had to be super additive in terms of development in mathematical terms. That is, they have to provide something more than what is achieved partially. The innovation system is particularly strong for some energy sources. For example, I'm referring to hydraulic and biomass energy resources, as they connect different resources for their production. In the International Council for Science, an analysis was carried out about possible synergies and conflicts between sustainable development objectives, and objective number 7 has potential conflicts with the food objectives, that is agricultural production, in the sense that it may have an impact on the availability of biomass or water, because these are needed for agriculture, and then there's another conflict in terms of water. There can be some competition there. Some of these conflicts are actually transnational, because in countries like Africa, they cover areas that go beyond the borders of individual nations. So problems may be quite important also in terms of strategy. As regards the cooperation among international institutions, they are now working on a model that is called the Nexus. This has been mentioned by the United Nations several times, and it stigmatizes the problem and the need to take interrelations into account at a high strategic level when development programs are designed, considering all the international and transnational actors, but also in terms of individual projects. What we've been told previously is that we have to be careful when working on specific problems, because there's a nexus issues. That is, there is interaction, that it can be positive or negative interaction with other aspects of development. So even targeted actions must consider this issue of compatibility and synergy and interconnections. What is different with climate? Climate may exacerbate these conflicts, for example, in areas such as Africa, where there's climate scenarios that are not particularly positive. A few days ago, the special report on land-based resources was released by IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, and we've read from the media that there's a high risk of loss of land for agriculture with desertification. So climate scenarios really lead to a situation where conflicts might be exacerbated with a lot of uncertainty. If we look at climate scenarios in Africa, we see that water availability is increasing in West Africa, but is decreasing for sub-Saharan Africa and other areas in Africa. So we may summarize all this situation by saying that there is a risk increase. When there is a risk increase, then political strategy also comes into play. We often talk about mitigation strategy when we talk about development, but in fact, when we consider sub-Saharan Africa countries, we see that they have an emission capacity and an impact on the climate change factors that is really low, but they suffer the most from the changes in climate. So the response here must consider adaptation. Adaptation policies are in the increase now in the consensus of climate policies in the Paris conference and in other situations. But the main point of adaptation policies is that they are different in nature. When we mention the fact that there's climatic strategies, we normally consider a well-defined set of factors. But when we talk about adaptation, we mean to revise completely planning and intervention actions in many areas in the choice of actions for agriculture or water management and so on and so forth. So I'm talking about something that can be really, really complex, that inevitably can also have further consequences in terms of further complexity about energy and the energy mix. There's another interesting point I would like to mention. When there's conflicts with the biomass area, we can also consider optimal mixes with fossil sources. I'm referring to gas because it's impossible sometimes to have a development that is fully based on renewable energy in Africa. That's impossible. I have to think about strategies that can take on board fossil components with an optimal mix to avoid the conflicts that I have mentioned. The other point I would like to mention concerns investment and business models. We have some estimates on East Africa and in general on sub-Saharan Africa, and we know that having full access to energy for the population may require investments in terms of $160, $170 billion in the next few years. These are huge amounts of money. There's a great potential we need for a great flow of investment. And in terms of investment, energy investment in Africa at the moment, there is international donations, there's some private subjects, and there's China. According to the estimates I have elaborated, 30% of new electricity capacity in 2015 is in the hands of China. So that's a massive presence that has already been criticized in a way by Marco because of the kind of approach involved. Besides the problems I've mentioned about climate, there's also an issue about expectations and also concrete implementation of significant financial flow. We call this climate finance. It's a very complex architecture that relies on commitments adopted by donating countries in the Copenhagen conference, and then that was then confirmed in the Paris conference. It is a complex system. There's 30 agencies and institutions that are working on the climate finance, 21 multilateral funds and 7 bilateral funds, 15 funds from receiving countries. And there's a series of issues here that the Conference of the Parties in 2018 also didn't solve. Whatever the level of funding we have in the climate issue, the general call is to involve private subjects. Private subjects are becoming a fundamental element in this strategy because of their size, and also in order to avoid the limitations involved in the public subject intervention. And with the private participation, we immediately have to talk about business models. What are the business models that are now coming on the way? One is called impacting investing. Impacting investing is a way of investing where the private subject aims to have a return with the social objectives. Impact finance is expanding. It is not huge. Sub-Saharan Africa is receiving about 14% of impact finance at international level. We have fundamental issues here, in my view, about impact finance, especially as regards the impact. If indeed we can provide a convincing measure and to deal with the social environmental impact with this kind of funding model. Then another model is called inclusive business, generated out of the theories of the basis of the pyramid formulated some years ago. And it's again a kind of social private intervention. This model is now increasing. It's not particularly dynamic. It is a bit difficult to involve private subjects, as it envisages to leave a lot of value on the community. In Italy, a small number of companies are using this kind of model of inclusive business, but in any case, it is a model that, together with impact finance, is considered to be capable of change the impact of intervention on development. I have some doubts, personally, on the motivations that may revolve around the social character or the private character of these business models. In some way, I have the feeling that we are going from a public intervention model based on grants, together with the private subjects and the non-profit organization, to a model that is different. Public subjects would offer guarantees and would favor some actions, but there is also a strong intervention of private social subjects. There is a proliferation of models, but I still believe more in the not-for-profit public model. This is because, considering what I've said, I have to consider the whole dimension of development, and in some way, the cooperation intervention is similar to a public good. The presence of strong private interests, in my view, may put the preservation of the common good at risk, which is the respect for the other sectors and the respect for an integrated development. But that's something you can think about and decide what you think about that. And the last point concerns finance, as seen in a new light. We have seen a strong rotation of the financial system over the last few years. I'm also talking about central banks and European regulators, big actors of the financial and banking systems that are rapidly increasing the problem of climate risk in granting finance. There is a process that is leading all the activities that are at risk of climate change or that may be subject to the effects, negative effects of climate change, so they can be discriminated and not obtain grants. Conversely, there's some other activities that have a climatic premium that may be favored in the allocation of funding. So this is a critical turning point, because when finance moves towards a certain direction, then many other things come with it. And the situation here is something like this. Whatever the business model, even a more conventional one, will have to include reference to the climate change issue and show that there is no climate risk, there won't be problems related to climate change, and that they will be able to catch up for any possible problems. So this is something that will be present more and more in the next few years. Thank you.
Allora, grazie Roberto.
Thank you very much, Roberto. Now, let's go directly to the Q&A session, because we are somewhat 10 minutes late on the agenda. Stay with us. We still have 25 minutes to go. If you want to ask questions, please ask short questions, and speakers will give you short answers. So there is a microphone. Please grab the microphone and ask your question. Let's get 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll have the answers.
I actually have to express my appreciation to you for inviting me here, and I think I've learned so much, from this. I am the Nigeria's ambassador to the Holy See, and I was so pleased to hear so many of your comments on Africa. I am going to make comments, not ask questions. The first thing is that climate change is one of the few things that I am actually interested in as a person. So, you shouldn't be surprised that you went and introduced the oven in Mozambique, yet the people were still interested in what they were doing before. This is because you did not follow the concept of appropriate development. Any development that is not in sync with the knowledge of the people cannot stand. So that was why I was very pleased with the professor who talked about inclusive business as one of the models appropriate for better development. So my suggestion is that for any future intervention in the issue of climate change in Africa, the people themselves must be included in whatever solution that you are trying to provide in mitigating the effect of climate change. Thank you very much.
Grazie, ambasciatore.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you very much for the intervention. And then let's see whether we'll give the floor to Alessandro for any further remarks. And now we'll continue with the questions. I'm Giuseppe Grande. I have many questions, but I'll stick to one. I studied engineering for development cooperation in Milan. And improved ovens have been a business case in our lectures. I studied in a project of a research lab at the American University of Cairo to desalinize water in rural areas that have no access to energy. That's very interesting. And then I'm now working in Prism Group. We produce electric cables. We are world leaders. This is an Italian company. And therefore, we could be one of the businesses that were mentioned, like Eni and Enel. My question is the following. I was really very passionate on development cooperation. What can be the role of my company be? Because, as was mentioned, Africa is a potential market. And what can my role be? Because I'm working and I'm living in Finland, and I'm a young engineer. I'm growing in a multinational company, and I know that this company can really contribute to this topic. Thank you for your question. Let's continue. Let's get another 2 questions. My name is Giuseppe Valerio. I'm an engineer, I'm retired, and for the past 9 years, I've been managing a vocational school in Nairobi. I would like to introduce a very important topic which has been mentioned, which is education. It is a fundamental problem for energy distribution in third world countries. The problem is that technology can provide wonderful tools. After 1 year, they no longer work. And usually, as typically happens in Africa, everything stops because nobody can continue using these systems, these technological systems. For years, we've been helped by AVSI and by Rest for Africa. And we are now committed to create and train technicians in Africa, directly in Africa. We are creating very beautiful conditions, moving conditions. We have developed, for example, a model whereby we can integrate solar energy with diesel generators using fuel which is recycled by exhausted oil or produced in rural areas. I just wanted to say this to tell you that there are many things and many projects that can be implemented thanks to the help of private Italian partners. We need to focus on education and we need to develop education. For example, this model, which has just been developed as a pilot project right now, should be supported by future projects. This is just an input I want to give you. Thank you for your question. We've seen that with reference to migration, local development is of the utmost importance, and sustainable development is also important. This is what AVSI and other NGOs are working on. At political level, what is being done in Europe? Does Europe understand that this topic is of the utmost importance or not? Good morning. It's a very simple question. What is the influence of climate change on migration? Is there any research on that? Can you give us some figures on this? I want to understand what is the state of the art in terms of research. I think that innovation is of the utmost importance for renewable energy. We've been stuck for a few years in terms of quality of renewable energy, especially with reference to solar power plants. Innovation on solar systems could also lead to a decrease in costs and better access to this type of energy. What is the state of the art on that? Does the European Union or some organizations provide funds on that? Any other questions? Okay. There's no other questions? Yes, there's one here, first row. Good morning. I want to make a remark on what was said by Mr. Alessandro. I live in Trentino. Northern region of Italy. People who do not live in the city of Trento, have a wood oven and they use it during the winter. Not because they need it, but because the food is better. Then it can also heat the house. So it's not that bad that there's a large percentage of the population that is still using charcoal and wood. Because the wood oven for pizza, for example, is the best one. It's much better than a gas oven. It's not just an economic or an ecological issue. Thank you. Thank you for your question. One last question here in the first row. Good morning to you all. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm a doctor and I deal with healthcare. Global healthcare. So I will focus on the word integration that you mentioned. Remember that healthcare is public. So mine is not a question, but more of a remark. I would like to urge you to make all people aware, make all citizens aware, so that they can understand the importance of what you are saying and of what scientists are saying, which often is unheard. So I want to focus on training. Training and education is important. I think it is of paramount importance. So it is important to concentrate on a network of education for global healthcare. Sometimes the words are hardly understood by people, but they must be understood. They must be simplified. In April, I was in Padua for the first Festival of Global Healthcare. There will be future editions every year so that all people can understand this concept, these topics, and can understand the interaction between the different sectors. So I'm very happy to hear that everything is intertwined. To conclude, For a long time, I've been studying a cross-cutting language, and I'm writing an article entitled "Global Healthcare Culture Will Save the World." So, what we are doing today is something constructive, a constructive debate. Each one of us has its own skills, knowledge, experiences, and shares it with others so that everyone can achieve the best possible result to the benefit of all. Thank you very much for your questions. Now I'm going to give the floor to our speakers. There were a couple of questions on the role of education, culture, and training. So let's talk about the role of human factor, which is fundamental, because people are always at the center of that. So according to personal skills, they can achieve or not achieve sustainable development. To my right, any volunteer to answer this question? The professor. Roberto.
Ovviamente pregando.
Please be as short as possible.
È acceso, sì, mi sentite?
Well, of course, a university professor is quite interested in education and in training. That's what we do every single day. So it is important to find the right ways to educate and to train. We're also used to having exchange students, to send our students abroad and to do internships, but different models are also needed. The Catholic University is now using an initiative that is called E4 Impact, which is an education experience of African subjects with African universities. So we have a collaboration with African universities to educate African entrepreneurs. So it's a knowledge transfer model that has particular feature, and we hope it can be really effective. And then the most spread model of people's education implies an energy infrastructure, as we have said. Without electricity, which is the modern form of using energy, we cannot do anything. Without energy, without electricity, we can't organize advanced education, advanced training initiatives. But since I have the microphone, I would like to respond to the last point that was mentioned about global health. I think it is extremely important in relation to energy. There is a report published on Lancet. This was published recently, and it tells that 1/3 of death in the world is due to pollution. And we're talking about water pollution, biological pollution, and air pollution. And these are also and particularly linked to the use of energy, in particular fossil fuel, but not only that. So there is still a strong link as concerns integration. We know that indoor pollution is also a cause of many deaths, and the use of heating systems, for example, is really relevant here. So there cannot be a separation with the energy issue. In Europe, we have now learned to link the environment to health. We have a tradition about this of not looking at the environment alone. But in the United States, for example, the environment policies are designed on the basis also of considerations about people. So that's the way we should go. Thank you, Roberto. And Marco, I would like you to respond to the question about technology. Perhaps if you want to mention the role of technology, for example, in the renewable sources, for example, solar energy, water energy, offshore energy. These are quite spread now, and even cheaper than fossil fuel resources. Well, yes, I can do that, but I would like, if I may do so, I would like to recall a keyword that the ambassador mentioned in his intervention, and this is fundamental, that is partnership. Partnership is a synonym for integration, and it is not by chance that the UN Development Goals are, as people know, it's 16+1. I don't want to mention the number 17 because it brings bad luck, but I say 16+1. But that +1 is the instrumental, the methodological tool, the approach. We do not have a sustainable development goal that can be reached without partnership. Partnership are fundamental elements. What is the World Council of Energy? We may be good interlocutors about this. The organization started in 1930 on the basis of the consideration that energy has a fundamental role in the debates. For Italy, there's the Ministry of Economic Development, the Ministry of Energy, etc. There's Eni and Enel and other companies, and there's hundreds of other companies involved in the energy sector, such as Eni, Terna, SMA, and other companies. And there's also the academic component in that council. They meet to have a discussion, to debate, and the idea of having a partnership with the communities, with the stakeholders, and having engagement with the people is the key dimension that will help us design successful policies, or rather unsuccessful policies. As regards technological development, what can I say? Well, we have another important word that we have to be careful when we use it, that is singularity. What we have learned about development over the last 150 years was a kind of linear approach. Every year I had 10 innovations, so in 10 years I have 100 innovations. Now, in the energy sector, thanks to the pervasiveness of ICT and the digital industry that is now governing how we work, we are reaching an exponential development. So we won't have an accumulation of innovations according to a linear factor, but there's an explosion of that. We have moved from solar panels that had a price of 300, 320, 350 euro per megawatt hour, but today to a new panel that can be part of a grid or other forms of panels that cost 27, 28 euros per kilowatt hour. So is this enough? The answer is no, but I can give you a couple of examples that can help you understand that this is a central issue. First, we should ask ourselves, what is the most powerful computer in Europe for supercomputing? It is in the city of Piacenza, a city in Italy, and it was built by Eni, the Eni company, because Eni aims to improve the quantity and the quality of its actions, for example, in managing its supplies, because there is an increase in the economic management of that, but also in the environmental management of that. I mentioned big companies, and I'm sorry about that, but these are the stronger examples. I could also mention more specific situations, but Enel has 5 innovation centers from Singapore to Tel Aviv to Moscow to the Silicon Valley, and they were created on the basis of the need to consider more and more innovation streams that are not planned, that are not centralized as they used to be in the past. Eni opened a headquarters in the Polytechnic of Milan and one in the Polytechnic of Turin to be at the center of innovation. The EU, so you may avoid providing you a promotion about this, have in the Horizon funding lines and other innovation funding lines has something about it. In the 28 countries of the EU, this can be considered, and Italy is one of the main actors. If we look at the performance of the projects in Horizon 2020 with its universities and private subjects, we see that Italy plays an important role. So, in my view, the answer is development, research and development is not just the core thing, but it is the element that will change the situation, the outlook of our situation. And the last point I would like to mention is this: what can we do? I can tell you about my experience. I work for Edison. Edison was established in 1883 in Milan, and it's always been a classic energy company in Milan. But over the last few years, Edison changed its strategic model. It completely changed its investment plan, and it adopted a model based on the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations with 9 objectives that are not just aimed at improving the use of renewable energy, but also, for example, they are aimed at increasing the number of female employees in the managerial positions, at improving education. So they try to cover all the 17 objectives in our way of life. I am sure that within those objectives there can be a subject, an element that can check whether the objectives of the company are in line with the SDGs, if the investment plans are in line with the modern business models, and also if the company has the capability of having the values that are important to you to work, but also if you can be really a determining factor to promote green models and funding models that are useful to invest in the future. So I think that this answer has been really strong, and it can be even stronger in the future. Right now, let's try to get to a conclusion of the panel in 6-7 minutes, so be patient. I would like to give a couple of minutes to Alessandro to reply to the question that was mentioned before. Our African friends often tell us that in Africa it can be cold, so the use of firewood and coal to prepare food, of course, is also done for heating purposes. So the situation is maybe more complex than it was depicted. So in a few minutes, if you wanted to give us a reply about this, and then we can also tackle the issue of migration.
Mi devo scusare per...
Yes, I do apologize because I told you that I would explain better, but then the ambassador's question made me understand that I actually did not explain what I wanted to explain. Well, here we are talking about improved cook stoves. And it is based on a local technology, and we are using locally produced models that were created in Rwanda, Tanzania, or Rwanda. So it is not a European model that was imported. So I didn't explain myself very well. Then I was complaining because people wouldn't use this access. And in this case, I talked about the global problem, as in 2 billion people that in 2030 will continue using wood and coal. I was not making reference to my project. Actually, our project was very successful. It was one of the projects that were most successful in the energy sector. German Cooperation, which is a world leader in this field, asked us to use our own development model, which is actually the one we have developed with a participatory inclusive approach in Mozambique and was then used also in Uganda. And now German Cooperation is asking us to apply it, use it in the Congo Democratic Republic and in Rwanda. So actually our project was very successful. I'm considered as an expert of clean cooking. The problem is the size of the problem. I joined Cooperation because I wanted to solve the problem of hunger and poverty for all the poor people, not just for one person. And so I was not happy because I couldn't actually solve the global problem, which is what I want to do. I will give an answer to the boy from Trento. This is part of the problem. Because we tried to convince the lady to use alternative models, but we are still using wood and coal because the food is tasty. In Trentino, there's very stringent laws on the use of wood. You have rules and everything. In Africa, our Chinese friends behave as they want to behave. In Mozambique, there's a law for every cut tree, you have to plant a new one, but it's a rule which is not respected. It's not complied with. There are 2 million people who die at home because they are not aware of the problems in cooking with wood and charcoal. So something has to be done. What can we do? We need to worry, first of all. This is my take-home message. 5 years ago, I was skeptical and I was not thinking about the problem of climate change. The message, the take-home message is just be worried for yourself and for your family. Now I'm working on this topic. And if you look at what is happening and you're interested in that, ice melting, you go to the mountains, you see that there is no glacier anymore because ice is melting. That will have an impact. It does have an impact. Salmons are today dying in Alaska. The glaciers in Himalaya are melting. First of all, we need to be worried and be concerned. And then we need to adapt ourselves and find solutions. Granmenos Mastroianni, who is an expert of Italian cooperation, who has written many books, the European Union, major companies, universities, and strong powers are working on that, but the civil society is lagging behind. Thank you. Thank you, Alessandro. Francesca, 1 minute. Yeah. Another major concerns in order to give hope to people who want to know what they can do in Africa. There are many small and medium enterprises working and investing in Africa. In the island that I mentioned, there's Absolute Energy, an Italian company, and they have created a plant in that island which is still working. So what should we do? We must think differently. We need to invest in Africa, not according to our own Italian and Western mindset, but adjusting to local needs. Thinking that consumers are people living in an African village and they are not Western consumers. So you need, first of all, to listen. You need to educate, raise awareness, and above all, you need to work in partnership with local companies. There's a lot of local innovation that we cannot even think of. But that local innovation is of the utmost importance, and whoever wishes to invest must create a partnership with local entrepreneurs. Thank you, Francesca. 30 seconds. And I apologize for being very short, for giving very short answers on migration. We have realized that this is a priority. Africa, our neighborhood continent, is a priority for the European Union and for development cooperation. So I could give you some examples of projects. But there's no time, unfortunately. As for the relation between climate change and migration, this is a complex link. In addition to extreme weather events and situations like in the Pacific Ocean where islands are disappearing, there are people moving from the countryside to cities. This is the first type of migration. In rural areas, soils are no longer productive. Families have many members. 66 million people every year move from the countryside to the cities. And the non-effective management of the human dimension of urbanization leads to an increasing number of people that after spending some years in the suburbs of African megalopolis try to migrate elsewhere. So there's no direct relation whereby a person in Sahel due to climate events migrates to Europe. But there's a sort of cycle whereby mass migration goes from the countryside to the cities. That type of migration is not effectively managed, and that leads to an increase in migrants to Europe and other parts of the world. But the situation is much more complex than that, and therefore urbanization and city management is a priority of our development cooperation. And with that, I conclude. Thank you very much to all of you for your attention and for your participation in this very interesting debate. Thank you very much to all the partner organizations. We have organized this debate with the European Union, AVSI, ASVIS, the Catholic University, and the partnership at large. You have the opportunity to make donations, as you know, at the dedicated desks with the hashtag Dona Ora, donate now, which is represented by a red heart. With that, thank you very much once again to the speakers for their contribution, and see you next time.